Here we will just talk about the economic context, in particular the economic history context for the History of Economic Thought course. And it's the economic history context of Africa. Our thinking doesn't occur in a vacuum, and the peculiarities of this continent economically, but also geographically and in other ways, is very important. And I've selected a book by John Iliffe, who's a Cambridge scholar. The book is titled Africans, the History of a Continent. It's already into its third edition. And that book is, Iliffe is sort of follows the tradition of historians in a tradition of Brodel. And that is really looking at the big sweep of history and working it out on the basis of very small and detailed information. And what we see, and what you'll be reading in this book, obviously not the whole book, you'll focus on the first two chapters. And I've uploaded that on the Sakai website. But what Iliffe is looking at, he's looking at the history of the continent going back into the period of, say, I can't even remember, 20, 30,000 Neolithic periods and Ice Age, and then taking it up all the way to the present. But what you will find is that, contrary to popular belief, the problem with Africa has always been that the continent has been vastly underpopulated. So I think in the period of about 1700s, the population of the African continent was only about 50 million people, whereas the world population by then was probably in the region of 500 million. Here's my phone. So in the meantime, I've just checked up some statistics. For instance, in the year 0, the population of the African continent was about 16 million, whereas the world population was 230 million. So that's about 7% of the world population. And that's 2,000 years ago at the time of Christ. And most of that population, half of it probably would have been living in Egypt. So the sub-Saharan population would have been in the region of 3% or 4% of the total world population. At the moment, I think Africa's population makes up about 20% of the world population. In another 50 years, it will rise to about 35% of the world population. And we're moving in Africa from a situation of underpopulation to overpopulation. And the period of underpopulation is important for an economic development because, I mean, even if we take the theory of Adam Smith, he says that the division of labor depends on the extent of the market. It depends on the size of the market. The smaller a market is, the less can there be a division of labor. And division of labor is important for efficiency purposes. So if we have seen economic underdevelopment, looking at the period before 1900 certainly, then a lot of it has to do with the small size of the population of the African continent. And in a sense, what we'd have to look at is, why was the population small like that? And what has changed that there has been this tremendous growth in the population? And what are the economic consequences of this growth in population? Because what we'll be seeing, and you can see that in the resources I've posted, whereas most of the regions of the world will experience a flattening of the growth or in population, even a decline, the African continent is expected to grow its population well, all the way to about 3 billion by the year 2050 and possibly 4 billion by the year. There are many reasons why the African continent was historically underpopulated up until, let us say, the mid-1900s. One reason is the disease burden on the continent. You know, you're all familiar with malaria, bilharzia, the sleeping sickness, killing people by the millions, the tsetse fly killing animals. I remember reading a book by an English explorer by the name of Richard Burton. And at the time they were trying to find the source of the Nile, and they're going from Mombasa in Kenya towards Lake Victoria, that region. They were looking at about 1,500 kilometers. And him and his colleague, Speak, his name was Speak, they were sick all the time. They couldn't walk. They had to be carried by the porters. These were people, indigenous people who were used to the climate, who were used to the insects, but the Europeans just couldn't deal with it. That they survived was a miracle, and many other such explorers didn't survive. And so the diseases on the continent accounts for a large, at least for some portion of the fact that the continent was relatively underpopulated. A further reason is the geography of the continent. In the center, there are those massive rainforests, and if you read any book on survival in the rainforest, you'll be amazed how difficult it is. You know, it doesn't teem with wildlife. There's hardly any food to be had. And so that was not a very habitable area either. And then you've got the deserts. But it isn't just the deserts and the rainforests, those two extremes, but it's also the lack in microclimates. In Switzerland, where I come from, you know, farmers during the summer, they take their animals up into the mountains where it isn't so hot, where there's beautiful grazing grounds. And then in winter, they take them down into the valleys where it's warmer. And so there's the ability to use the different microclimates to not only help your animals survive, but also to have variations in the food crops that you can grow. But that's not the case for most of Africa. You look at the plateau on which we are living. You know, we're living at the altitude of 1,600 meters, 1,700 meters, and it extends at that altitude for most of southern Africa. And so you don't have many hills or microclimates where you can basically alternate the type of food that you're growing and where you're taking the animals. It's different in the area of Kenya, Uganda, where you've got the Ruwenzori Mountains and Mount Kilimanjaro. If you go further north, you will see, again, you get into a very uniform area all the way through the desert region, all the way through to the Mediterranean. And so with those geographic conditions, food security has always been a problem. In fact, there was a noticeable explosion in the population of Africa when the banana was introduced around about 1500 to the regions of, I think, what is today modern-day Uganda, because the local crops just were not nutritious enough to sustain a growing population. And then, of course, another reason for the underpopulation of the continent has been slavery, which first slavery was used, practiced in Africa by the Arab traders, and then as from the 1600s by the Europeans. And I can't remember the figures, but it's been estimated that some 15 million people were taken as slaves in the period 1500 to about 1800. And that's when the population of the continent was already low, and it was decimated further. So for many centuries, Africa experienced a decrease in the population rather than an increase in the population. And the problems associated with underpopulation were exacerbated as a result of that. You can see the effects of this underpopulation in the institutions and social practices of the continent. You may know that in India, which is very populated and it's had a huge population for many centuries, what you will see there is that there's a dowry, a system of dowry at marriage, where the family of the wife pays a dowry to the family of the bridegroom. And of course, you would have heard about wives that once they've been married and paid the dowry, they're treated very shabbily. And that is associated with overpopulation. But in the case of underpopulation, you have a situation where bride wealth is being paid. Most of the continent, we see that it is the man's family who pays bride wealth to the bride's family. And why is that? That is because of the value, effectively, of the woman. Because the woman is, if you like, a producer of labor. And if you on a continent where there's a shortage of labor, where there's underpopulation, labor becomes very important. And so there is value in an underpopulated, value in labor in an underpopulated continent in a way that you will not see value in labor in an overpopulated continent or area. Again, if you look at underpopulated regions such as the Arabian Peninsula, again, you will see not a system of dowry, but you'll see a system of bride wealth where the family of the husband pays the family of the wife. Political and other institutions are affected by low population density. So if you're not happy with the situation you find yourself in a village, in your area of habitation, it's easy to move on because there's so much land available. So Africa isn't just characterized historically by a low population, but also a high amount of land which is available. So you've got a low labor to land ratio, whereas in most other areas of the world, you would have had a much higher labor to land ratio. And if you were living in India, today and a long time ago as well, you didn't have much of an option to move away because all land has been in possession by some landlords. Whereas the migration in Africa over the past 2,000 years has been facilitated by this underpopulation, where it was easy to move south or move away. And you'll find that described in some detail in the book by Elif. I think the chapter there is titled The Frontiersmen. Other impacts and effects of underpopulation on institutions is, for instance, with polygamy. And that to a degree can be accounted for, the emergence of it can be accounted for in terms of the underpopulation, where this was a means of maximizing the population growth. And the problem that we of course have now is that these institutions that were encouraging population growth, which was difficult to obtain anyway because of the climatic and geographical and disease burden of the continent. All of a sudden, those practices that were seeking to maximize growth, population growth and child growth and labor growth, all of a sudden they came into effect in such a way that the population started to grow because the conditions that accounted for the low population growth was changed. Food became available easily, international trade, I mentioned the banana, the disease burden had been reduced, whereas people or families in the past would have 8 or 10 children, only 2 of which would survive. That is no longer the case. In the 1950s, 1960s, a region like Kenya experienced a population growth of 5, 6, 7%. That's really a doubling of the population every 10 to 15 years. And that's because the child mortality had greatly decreased. And the question for economists and scholars in development studies is what does that mean for the future of the continent? I remember I was at a conference some years ago in Ghana, and I met Nigerians. It wasn't an economics conference, it was a business-related conference. And the Nigerian was very proud of the fact that the population of Nigeria would reach 400 million by the year 2050. It's at present already at 200 million. And the attitude is that, well, a strong population means that you've got a strong country, but it can also be the case that a large population means a lot of unemployment and resulting consequences from that. So we've got to, as development theorists, as economists, we've got to think what's going to happen to the continent when its population grows from the present 1.3 billion to 3 billion by the year 2050. So what I'm saying is that the relative economic underdevelopment of Africa to a large extent has to do with the very underpopulation of the continent. This type of discussion on population growth and demographics is something that was first studied and initiated as a area of study at the time of classical economics, in particular by somebody known by the name of Thomas Malthus. And when we're looking at population growth and the miserization of the population, then we often referring to that as the population, the Malthusian population trap. What Malthus was saying, and we're talking about the time of about 1820, he was saying that there isn't much hope for a population to move out of poverty. He was even referring to England at the time. And that is about 40 years after the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. There was a lot of optimism because of that publication and belief that we're entering a brave new world, there will be economic growth. And then you had Malthus arriving on the scene saying that, no, actually what's going to happen is the moment that there's economic growth, people are just going to procreate, they're going to have many more children, and in fact the population will grow much faster than the growth in food supplies. And as a result of that, whatever little gains are being made in terms of wealth, they will be lost because any increase in wealth will now have to be distributed over a larger number of people, especially wealth in the form of food. And so he believed there's no point to even have social development programs because the moment you have the poor population rising beyond their poverty, they will just have more children, and that's going to drag them back down into the same state of abysmal economic conditions. So that was a concern in England in the 1820s, and there were poorhouses that had been instituted and that were being run. But because of the pessimism associated with the work of Thomas Malthus, many of those poor houses were simply cancelled, because it became a paradigm that there's no way that the world can move beyond, or certainly England at the time would be able to sustain a growing population, and any wealth would simply lead to a growing population, and then it would fall back into the same level of poverty. We will encounter Thomas Malthus again when we discuss classical economics. We'll look at him in a bit more detail. But it's amazing how 200 years later, the debate has sort of been repeating itself. It's not that long ago when many economists were saying that if the whole world wants to live like the Americans do, if everybody wants to have a Western standard of life, then that's impossible on the basis of the resources of this planet. And some were saying we would need 2 Earths, or even 3 Earths, to be able to give that standard of living to the whole world population as it is growing. Now, of course, if we had class, we could have a debate on this. I don't believe in that. I don't buy that argument. I think we can see that in terms of technological advancements, that it is not the case that only a small portion of the world's population could be sustained at a high living standard. I think this planet has what it takes to give abundance to a large population, and if we had the right economic institutions dealing with the real problems of the economy that has to do with the distribution of income and wealth, then there is certainly a possibility that everybody can enjoy a somewhat more comfortable standard of living than many are experiencing. Many, certainly all of those who are living beyond the poverty line. Anyway, this then some background, economic history background for the History of Economic Thought course. This should also help you a little bit with your first assignment. The first assignment, it's only 300 words that you got to write, but do the readings. The difficulty normally or usually is never in understanding what you're reading, but is a matter of reducing it to paper. And the few words that you have to write, the more difficult it is to summarize the material.